Okay. Hey, everybody. How's it going? Hey. Hey. 11:02. Let's get going. Exam was due today. How did it go for you? Yeah, good. Good. I look forward to reading them. I'll do my best to get them graded in a timely fashion. I'll just give everybody the heads up right now. I think the easiest way for me to grade these is to do like each section at a time. So I'll do like everybody's section 1, then everybody's section 2, then everybody's section 3. Otherwise, what could happen is that like I get a little fatigued, or maybe like my mood radically changes from one session grading to the next, and then it's harder to grade fairly that way. So if over the next week or so, let's hope it's only over the next week or so that it takes me to get these graded. If you see that like you're getting points for one section, but then like for some reason you still have 0 points for others, it's just because I'm not done yet. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. Phaedo. Which is an interesting and fascinating dialogue on so many different levels. Let's start here. Let's start by noting that we just had an exam. And now we're going to be talking about stuff. Why did we have the exam when we had it? A couple of reasons. One, I wanted to get the exam in before the drop deadline, so folks would have some sense of like whether, like, oh my God, I got to drop this class. But another reason is this is like a natural breaking point in the middle of our Plato readings. Before this, we were dealing with early Plato. Phaedo is still kind of like early middle sort of Plato. It's still early-ish, but an interesting shift is beginning to happen here in Phaedo. We're going to pick it up and run it forward into some of the later books of Republic. We already read book 1 in the beginning of book 2. We're going to read some later books of Republic. We're going to read another later dialogue called Parmenides, and then we'll be done with Plato. We'll move on to Aristotle. But in the earlier dialogues, what we're getting from Plato is we're getting a lot of Socrates from Plato. It's kind of it's always a mix of Plato and Socrates in a Platonic dialogue. But what we get in the early dialogues is that mix kind of tilted in favor of Socrates. And the themes and the focus of those dialogues are, and we can look at it in two ways. One way that we can look at it is noting that the themes of those early dialogues are about like really kind of urgent, on-the-ground sort of problems, especially in comparison to the pre-Socratics. The pre-Socratics were doing a lot of early cosmology. They were talking about, like, what is the universe made of? What's the principal arche of all things? And we noticed maybe a shift to things that are a little more tangible, questions that you've probably reflected on some level yourself before you ever walked into a philosophy class. Questions like virtue, questions of justice, questions about like how should we live, how should we act, what are the things that we should do on a daily basis. So there's a very kind of everyday shift in focus from the pre-Socratics to Socrates. And a lot of the early dialogues focus on those sorts of things. Another thing that we get in these early dialogues, I think more than in the later dialogues, and it kind of stands as the focus, and I think this is incredibly related to those thematic foci of things like piety and justice and virtue, is we get a demonstration of a Socratic method. I think these early dialogues, first and foremost, what they're really about, and what I think a contemporary philosopher has to gain from those early dialogues is a sense of how it is that philosophy should be done. We talked about this a little bit when we were looking at the pre-Socratics. We talked about how, if something new is happening here with the pre-Socratic philosophers, something philosophical as opposed to what came before. We talked about this shift from mythos to logos. But in these early Platonic dialogues, and in the example of Socrates, what we get is a whole lot of demonstration of what this method of applying the logos ought to look like. As a matter of fact, we get this sense of philosophy as not just something that one believes, not a viewpoint. In the sense that, I don't know if I talked about this earlier on in the semester, but a lot of times people will use the word philosophy and they'll preface it with my philosophy, or they'll say, my philosophy of life is blah, 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 as if philosophy is a perspective, or it's a viewpoint. That's certainly one way of thinking about philosophy. Socrates has kind of prompted us into thinking of philosophy as an activity, as something that you do, as something that has a method, the same way that any discipline has a method. Chemistry has a method, mathematics has a method, biology has a method, and philosophy has a method. And this is a very interesting method. We see it primarily in this method of Elenchus, this kind of question-answer sort of back and forth. Philosophy as this art of dialogue. One way that we might look at it, and I'm a really big fan of this kind of way of thinking about philosophy, and I think Socrates demonstrates it in a just beautifully clear way, is philosophy perhaps as the art of asking a question and what it is that we do in this question asking, or the art of dialogue with people, particularly people that we might disagree with. And question asking is like a very, very big part of this. There was even a question on the exam that asked us to kind of apply these themes of piety, virtue, and justice to the philosophical method. Did anybody try to take that question on? A couple of people?
What?
That was my favorite question on the exam. And I think it's definitely interesting. There are things that we can read into and see that, yeah, Socrates, he's performing piety in this Socratic method. He's performing virtue. He's performing justice in the Socratic method, especially when we see him against his interlocutors, where Thrasymachus is like the very picture of injustice, if there is injustice in conversation, trying to beat other people instead of trying to work together in harmony. Or piety is a sort of humility that Socrates demonstrates in Euthyphro, whereas Euthyphro seems to be lacking in that sort of humility that is possibly like integral to piety. So these are interesting and valuable things to draw on from these early dialogues. What we start to see in Phaedo and moving onward in these Platonic dialogues is a shift away from a kind of talking about what Socrates said and did, and Plato kind of coming into his own and starting to sort of articulate some of his own ideas, not relying on a Socratic set of ideas anymore, certainly launching off of those, but moving forward into that. And also a shift in thematic focus as well. Plenty of stuff still about virtue and justice and the like, and we'll see a way to bring all of these things together when we read some of these middle books in Republic about the form of the good. That's going to come back. But definitely a shift away from questions that are explicitly about ethics and politics, and more at questions of metaphysics, kind of returning to these metaphysical questions that we saw in the pre-Socratics, and bridging the gap between ethics and politics and these metaphysical questions. We start to get that here in Phaedo. What's Phaedo about? It's about his death. Well, he dies in it. Is the dialogue about his? Well, yeah, I suppose in a sense. Is that what they're talking about? Are they talking about Socrates' death? Indirectly, perhaps. They're talking about the soul. They're talking about the soul. So Phaedo it's a dialogue about the soul. It's got two themes, in fact, and these themes are woven together. We've got this question of the soul, particularly, is it immortal? And the question that never gets explicitly addressed in this, but all good students of early Platonic dialogues will probably guess that if we're going to talk about whether the soul is immortal, we're going to probably want to know what exactly the soul is anyway. That's going to be a floating question throughout this entire dialogue and perhaps for the rest of our discussion of Plato. And then we also get this introduction of the first time that we're really seeing this in an explicit sort of way, Plato's theory of forms. So we get an introduction of the theory of the forms, the soul as a topic of conversation, and how this relates to Plato's theory of forms. And perhaps how we can kind of maybe try to read this back on what we've read about Socrates in these earlier dialogues as well. Of course, we also get this very dramatic business about Socrates' death. And I think that whatever we can say about the metaphysical philosophy that gets done in Phaedo or the work that Plato is trying to do, it's hard to deny that one of the most compelling and touching And ultimately, let's be honest, like heartbreaking aspects of this dialogue is that it's a bunch of friends with their good friend as he dies. Sad. It's very sad. Anybody gotten to the very end of this dialogue already? I get misty sometimes. Even like on like 30, 31, 32 repetitions of readings, it still gets me a little bit. Whatever your opinion of Socrates is, this account of a bunch of friends being with their good friend as he dies, there's something very strong about that. Have any of you guys ever been with somebody when they died? It's pretty intense, yeah. Yeah. It's a incredibly intense sort of an experience to be with somebody when they die. I imagine an intense experience to die as well. And what we're seeing here is like how Socrates and his friends are interacting. And how do they, like what do they do on Socrates' deathbed? How do they spend his last hours? They have a conversation. They have a philosophical conversation, right? About the nature of the soul and its immortality. Is that a good way to spend your last hours? If you're Socrates? What if you're you? It would be scary. You don't know what's going to happen, right?
I'll know in like 10 minutes.
And you're focusing on this kind of unknown, right? Like, something's going to happen here. Like, what is it? Like, I don't know. Let's talk about it. No, let's not talk about it. It's scary. Let's push it away. Let's pretend like it's not an issue. But Socrates, as we know, this is not his style. Perhaps this shouldn't be any of our styles. What better time is there to talk about the soul than when you're about to die? Or what better thing is there to do with your friends before you die than to do philosophy with them? I've mentioned philosophy as like the art of asking a question. There are other places in some other Platonic dialogues where we get this sense that Plato also thinks that maybe we can think of philosophy as like it's the art of friendship. This is like how you are with your friends. This may seem a little bit strange because in the classroom we like kind of like raise it to this very kind of arid, abstract level. I don't know how many of you actually do philosophy with your friends. Maybe not in the academic sense, but reflect on this. See if you agree with like my experience of this. Maybe I'm different because I'm a philosopher, but I have a lot of people in my life that I call friends. The ones that I count as like my real true friends are the people that I've had long conversations with about the things that I think are most important and that they've shared with me what they think is the most important, and where we haven't shied away with like sharing what exactly we think, where we might disagree with one another, where we haven't said like, this is scary or inconvenient, so let's stop thinking about it. No, like we just kind of like plunge forward. What better way to spend time with your friends just before you die than doing the thing that like is perhaps most at the heart of friendship? And the topic of conversation, completely appropriate. Did this actually happen? Oh. There are good reasons to believe that like maybe this is not like how it actually happened. For starters, the structure of this dialogue is really weird compared to any of the other ones that we've seen. There's a kind of almost like there's a dialogue within a dialogue structure, right? So we get not just one introduction, we get two introductions. There's the first introduction, which is a conversation between Phaedo and a Socrates. Two C's? ECH, okay. Thanks. And this is well after Socrates' death. Socrates says to Phaedo, like, hey, I hear you were there when Socrates died. And Phaedo goes, yep, I was there. And Socrates says, tell me all about it. And Phaedo says, sure, here it goes. And then we get another introduction, which is like what Phaedo saw and how the whole thing went. This is notable for a couple of reasons. We might wonder, like, why would Plato adopt this sort of structure? Any guesses? Why would Plato build a dialogue within a dialogue, especially when this first intro is so brief? It's just like, hey, were you there? Yeah, I was there. Oh, tell me all about it. Maybe start with this question. Was Plato there? Does he appear at all in this dialogue? No, he doesn't appear at all in the dialogue, which might be surprising. What's that?
How does he know?
How does he know what happened?
Yeah.
How does Socrates know what happened? Because Phaedo tells him. Somebody who was there told him what happened. So maybe this is interesting for a couple of reasons. Plato is kind of communicating to us, like, I wasn't there, but this is what I've been told. Also, the fact that Plato wasn't there is maybe like more reason to start thinking in terms of like, this is maybe not Plato reporting faithfully on like what actually happened at Socrates' death. This is maybe Plato starting to venture forth and start offering his own ideas. So there is some significance to this bizarre structure of a dialogue within a dialogue. We're getting second-hand accounts. Now we're getting it from Plato, so it's a third-hand account of what happened at Socrates' death. Yes?
Were there any Platonic dialogues where Plato included himself as an adult character?
As an interlocutor?
Yeah.
Nope, none that I know of. In fact, the only one that comes readily to mind where he's even mentioned explicitly as being there at the dialogue is Apology. Yeah. Although we would imagine he was, like, it's not like he never knew Socrates.
Right.
He was there for plenty of conversations. He's just not a character in any of the dialogues, with that possible exception of that one moment in Apology where he says, there's young Plato over there.
But perhaps he could have been there for the death, but as an author,
Yeah.
wants to remove himself from it.
Yeah, hard to tell if he actually was there. I don't know if there's a whole lot of historical evidence for whether he was there or not, with the exception of this dialogue. And his notable absence in the discussion, along with the fact that we get this dialogue within the dialogue of like Phaedo telling Socrates what happened. Was there a question in the back? Nope. Okay, so Phaedo tells Socrates what happened. Oh, right. One more thing that probably needs to be mentioned. Phaedo and Socrates. I don't know if you know him. Plato's audience might have known him. Plato and Socrates are Pythagoreans. They're down in Samos, they're down in the southern coast of Italy, and would have been well known, or relatively well known, to anybody who was close to Socrates as like folks who were kind of coming from a Pythagorean approach. This is one of the hints that we get here of Plato, again, kind of going forth on his own. There's a heavy Pythagorean influence in Phaedo. There's also some mentions of like some other pre-Socratics, some of them implicit, some of them explicit. So we definitely should be on the lookout for shades of Pythagoreanism all through this dialogue. The whole idea of a soul that's immortal, already a Pythagorean idea, right? We're going to get talk about like maybe the soul is like a harmony, totally a Pythagorean idea. The two big characters in this dialogue besides Socrates, besides Phaedo and Socrates, are two other figures, Simmias and Cebes. Also, Pythagoreans. And we're going to get some hints of Heraclitus throughout this dialogue. We're going to get some hints of Parmenides, although we're going to get a whole lot more Parmenides in the dialogue Parmenides, obviously. And Anaxagoras as well. Anaxagoras gets called out by name in this dialogue at one point. So one of the things to take from this is that Plato had other teachers, not just Socrates. Socrates might have been like his most influential teacher. Socrates may have been like particularly near and dear to his heart. But Plato didn't only learn from Socrates. After Socrates' death, he went to Italy, spent quite a bit of time with the Pythagoreans. So there's a big Pythagorean influence on Plato and the work that he does after Socrates' death, which is pretty much all of his work. Certainly this dialogue is showing a lot of Pythagorean influence on Plato. But also we'll see that, yeah, we've got some contact with Heraclitus and Parmenides. That little battle between Heraclitus and Parmenides is going to come right up to the surface in Parmenides. And even Anaxagoras, and a kind of frustrated disappointment with Anaxagoras, which is going to come up in the end of this dialogue. So, intro number 1, Phaedo and Socrates. And we should note that this tells us a whole lot of stuff. Plato wasn't there. He's getting secondhand information, perhaps. That there's a big Pythagorean influence on this. And also, like, this kind of primes us to be looking for other pre-Socratic philosophers and their influence throughout this dialogue as well. Then we get another intro, in which everybody kind of comes into Socrates' cell, and they greet him. He's just woken up, takes the irons off of his leg, the shackles, takes them off, starts rubbing his leg, and he's like, that hurts. But now that the shackles have been taken off, and as he's sitting there rubbing his leg, he says, isn't it funny how pain and pleasure are so kind of intimately tangled up with one another? That shackle was painful, and now that I take it off, I feel relief. You ever get like a brain freeze when it goes away? It's not just like, oh, thank goodness that went. It's almost pleasant to have something painful stop. You get this weird little pleasure-pain comment at the very beginning, which I'll kind of give you a little hint about, like, where this is going to be relevant throughout the rest of the dialogue. This kind of question of mixture or the relationship between opposites. Somebody asked Socrates, hey, I hear you've been writing fables. Is that true? People have been talking about, like, you writing fables. And Socrates says, yeah, I totally have been writing fables. I had a dream, and the goddess told me that I should make music. Pythagoreanism. That I should make music. So yeah, I'm writing fables. Somebody asked me about Aesop's fables, and I said, like, there's going to be a point where, yeah, it was Stanton. There's going to be a point where Socrates says, like, yeah, I started doing this. So there's this question about fables and music and poetry. And that Socrates is kind of playing around, experimenting with these in the last moments of his life. Particularly noteworthy, given that this wasn't his typical bag. He didn't really operate in this sort of register before. He was more plain spoken. Not one for, like, beautiful stories. And we mentioned this before when Aesop came up, that, like, one of the misgivings that we might have about fables is that they're not true, right? They might be pleasant, but they're not necessarily true. This might be something important to keep in mind for the rest of the dialogue as well. We're going to get a big argument and an account of, like, perhaps why the soul is immortal. Is that true? Does Socrates even mean it to be true? Or is he telling a comforting story? Would it be comforting, by the way, if you were about to die or a friend was about to die, if somebody said, hey, you know, when you die, that's not the end. Your soul lives on. Some people shaking their heads, no, it wouldn't be comforting. Some people, yes, it would be comforting. Omar.
Can we go back to the thing about, like, the opposites?
Yep.
Wouldn't that be, like, influence from Heraclitus, who was really big on, like, opposites? And
Yep.
I know that they're, like, Plato and Aristotle had gripes with Heraclitus on opposites. And, like,
Yes.
how he viewed it and all that.
Yes, they did. Yeah, totally. In fact, one of the very first arguments that we're going to get from Socrates in this dialogue is an argument from opposites, and Heraclitus has his fingerprints all over it. Totally. Yep. Let's go back to this question of fables and the immortality of the soul. Raise your hand if you were taught this as a young child, that, like, when somebody dies, they just go someplace else. Is this a comforting thing to tell a child? Is this a nice story? It may or may not be true, but it's definitely a nice thing to hear. Especially for a small child that they might not be able to wrap their minds around what it would mean to just stop existing altogether, to, like, just completely perish. There's this question of, like, well, where did Grandpa go? Grandpa went someplace else. Where? Someplace nice. That's a nice story. What happened to my dog? It went up to a farm. Upstate, yeah. It has lots of room to run and play. This is a nice story. Maybe this is a nice thing for Socrates to do for his friends. He's about to leave them. They're scared. They're sad. He'll tell them not to worry. It's all going to be okay. Maybe it's true. Maybe it's not. Certainly a nice story. And then at the end of this intro, we get this idea of philosophy being preparation for death. And actually, kind of a strangely challenging notion comes out of the very end of this intro, and particularly this question. So on the heels of this conversation about writing fables and poetry and all of that stuff, somebody mentions, hey, actually, yeah, I have a good friend, the poet Venice was asking. He also heard that you had been writing fables, and is this true? And Socrates says, like, yes, it's true, and I've been dabbling with poetry. And the guy says, well, Venice sends his regards, says he's sorry that he couldn't be here. What message can I bring back to him? And Socrates says, well, tell him that he'll follow me as quickly as he can if he's wise. Follow him. Follow him where? To death, right? He'll follow me as quickly as he can if he's wise. Did Socrates just tell Venice to commit suicide? Like, Simmias mentions this. He says, like, that's a hell of a thing to say, Socrates. That, like, is it just Venice or all of us? Like, should any person who, like, aspires to wisdom, should they follow you as quickly as they can? To death. And Socrates is like, well, yeah, sure. Philosophy is... Any philosopher would welcome death as a friend. I'm starting to get the sense that maybe Athens was right to put this guy to death. This is a dangerous message to be sending to people. Not the first time that we may have heard this message either. This is one of the dangers of talking about, like, oh, the afterlife is awesome. Oh, is it so awesome? Yeah, better than it is here on Earth. Oh, okay. Well, let's all kill ourselves then, right? Why wait? Let's get there as quickly as possible. And Socrates does this. It really is. I find it a completely dissatisfying sort of dismissal of, like, well, I'm not telling you to commit suicide. Well, why not? Well, because the gods have a plan for you, and maybe they're not done with you yet. So, like, you can't die until it's your time to die. But how do you know when it's your time to die? Was this Socrates' time to die? He could have taken action to avoid it. Would have harmed his soul, perhaps, yeah.
He was also in his 70s.
What's that?
Wasn't he also in his 70s at this point?
He was in his 70s. I don't know if that means it's time to die. When you're in your 70s, we'll check in and see. Like, are you ready? Yeah, but maybe he felt like I've done enough. It's like it's true that it is, and I think this is one of the important things that comes out of Apology and Credo, is we get this sense that, like, especially as young people, we're kind of, we're vacillating back and forth. I'm one of you. But yeah, I'm younger than people who are about to die. Younger than people who are very keenly aware of their mortality. We kind of vacillate back and forth between just, like, pretending or imagining that we're immortal and we're never going to die. Or just kind of feeling like, no, I'll do whatever I can to stay alive. This is a strong instinct to stay alive. And one of the things that Plato and Socrates kind of draw out in Apology and Credo is this idea that it can be unseemly. It can be shameful to cling to death at all costs, or to cling to life at all costs. There are things that you could do to avoid death that are just not good things. Sometimes the right thing to do is to just let it happen. Philosophy is a preparation for death. Socrates says that, well, in most ways, philosophers are already pretty close to dead. His friends kind of laugh. This is a little bit of a funny joke. Anybody who wasn't a philosopher and looked at the way that a philosopher lived might say that, like, yeah, they're already pretty close to dead. Especially if there's like this tendency to kind of disregard the pleasures of the body. Food, drink, wine, sex, all of these things. The philosophers, not concerned with them. Money, all of the material goods of this life. We say like, forget about those. Those aren't important. A life of the mind, that's what we want. Already pretty close to dead already as a philosopher. Socrates points out that this is the goal of the philosopher. Like in everything that they do, is to try to disentangle the soul from the body. To try to get to this point where like we kind of disregard the body and we just focus on like what is it that the soul can achieve on its own without getting distracted by bodily desire or bodily fear. We might even remember going back to some of the pre-Socratics, particularly folks like Parmenides. There was this incredible Orphic influence, including this idea that going to the underworld and coming back is like a way of kind of achieving a sort of knowledge or wisdom, that there's some kind of achievement there. And we talked about how there are stories of Parmenides himself depriving himself of food and drink and lying down in a dark cave and trying to shut all of his senses down to see like what happens. Will his mind wake up if we can quiet the body down long enough? There's totally some sense in which Socrates has a point here, that what it is that the philosopher tries to do in life is pretty close to what happens in death, the separation of the soul from the body. What the hell is the soul anyway, right? When I say soul here, the separation of the soul from the body, are there some of you that are just like, what? There's no such thing. What are you talking about? There's no soul. Only two people who are skeptical of the existence of a soul. The rest of you guys are like, yeah, sure, soul. Tell me, those of you who are like, yeah, sure, soul. What is it? It's not the body, right?
They talk about soul, spirit, and
Is there a difference?
I believe that soul is what makes up a person's character.
Soul is what makes up a person's character.
Everyone has different characters.
Everybody has a different character. Everybody has a different body, too, though.
Different body.
Yeah.
So that soul makes up that person. And so spirit is,
Is spirit something different, or is spirit also your character?
what?
Is spirit also your character, or is it something different than that? Character might be close. This is a very Aristotelian idea, too, that character and soul are very closely related to one another. We'll get to that soon enough. Not today. When I say soul, are you thinking of like what, like a ghost or something like this? Is this spirit? No, not that. Clearly not the body, though. After all, we're talking about the separation of the soul from the body. The word here, by the way, that's being thrown around by Socrates and his friends is not soul. That's an English word. It comes from the German. But it is suke. I'm going to go ahead and do it with the U instead of the Y. Suke. Which you might recognize from psyche. Yeah. For which a better word for psyche, rather than soul, might be mind, yeah. So if you're kind of having misgivings about this soul, keep in mind that the word that we're throwing around here could just as easily be translated as mind. Now, even then you might say, like, what's a mind? Is it distinct from the body? Isn't a mind just a brain? There's plenty of contemporary philosophy of mind that's trying to grapple with this idea. Can we just talk about brains, or do we have to think about minds as something different than a physical brain? This is still a live question. So if you can wrap your mind around the idea that a mind is a thing that's not exactly the same thing as a body, maybe you've got enough to start following this conversation about like what a soul is. We can also think about this if we want something even simpler than this without kind of spelunking down into the depths of what exactly a mind is and how it might be different than a body. We can just recognize that there's a difference between things that are alive and things that are dead. This is the way Aristotle's going to do it too. He's going to say like, some things are alive, some things are dead. The difference between the things that are alive and the things that are dead is that the alive things have a soul. That's like, if you can get on board with that there's a difference between alive things and dead things, that alive things have something that dead things don't, then we can just say, all right, soul is this like placeholder word for whatever it is that an alive thing has that a dead thing doesn't. If you are thinking of like a ghost, perhaps there might be some problems with that as well. Maybe we'll get to them in this dialogue. Maybe you won't get to them until you read some Descartes. All right, intro 1, intro 2, we get all of the basic themes in the room. Yes, Tom.
When I first read the part about if he's wise, he'll follow me soon, before I continue forward, what I got from that was, if you're a wise person, what happened to me? What happened to you?
Ah, you'll stand up to injustice, even at the risk of death. Yeah, perhaps. I think that's a perfectly reasonable reading of it too.
Especially given that during this time, Athens was a lot less shiny than it had been.
Yeah, that's certainly. I think that's a totally plausible reading. Although it is interesting that when Simmias says like, "Whoa, are you saying that like we should all die?" Socrates doesn't say like, "No. I'm saying you should speak truth to power." That's what I'm saying. No, he leans right into it and says, "Philosophy is preparation for death. After all, doesn't it seem like what we're doing in philosophy is pretty much the same as what happens when one dies? Separation of the soul from the body." After all, too, when we're wondering, like, is this what's going on when people do philosophy? Is philosophy preparation for death? Is it, in fact, the separation of the soul from the body? There's more to this, by the way, than just kind of ignoring bodily pleasure and saying that, like, that's like you have to ignore these things in order to, like, wake your mind up in order to do philosophy. There's also something about, like, what it is that philosophy, not just a negative sort of sense of, like, philosophy as a disregarding of the body, which it may or may not be, by the way. It might not be the case that philosophy is a disregarding of the body. After all, like any kind of empirical philosophy, if there are empiricists, we'll try to see some of those in the Hellenistic philosophers that come after Plato and Aristotle. Plenty of folks that say the bodily senses are a perfectly valid tool, perhaps one of the most reliable tools for doing philosophy. Plato's going to end up disagreeing with this in a pretty strong way, but we're going to only start to get a sense of why here in this dialogue, and it has to do with this idea of the forms. We already get like a little bit of an introduction of exactly what the forms are. When we think of like what are the things that Socrates is focused on? What are the concepts that he's chasing down? What are the things that he is like most concerned with in his philosophical activity? They're things like virtue, justice. We saw piety. And notice I put capital letters on all of these. Do you ever see capital J justice? Do you see it with your eyes? Do you hear it with your ears? Is this something that you apprehend bodily? We might even think back to Meno, when Meno gives his swarm of bees answer, right? He gives two swarm of bees answers. He says, there's a different virtue for different people, different virtue for a man, for a woman, etc., etc. Socrates says, yeah, but what do they all have in common? What is it that they all have in common? What is it that, by virtue of which they all count as virtue? We can look at the same thing in the concept of justice and the way that it played out in Republic I. This conversation between Socrates and Thrasymachus is one where Thrasymachus at least starts out trying to argue that, like, no, the real justice is the justice that happens, that we can see. It's the justice that, like, actual rulers put into practice. And Socrates says, like, that's not the real justice. The real justice, perhaps, is something that never happens. This already, we're starting to get some kind of sense of what it is that the philosopher is after. Not just virtuous acts, not just virtuous people, but the form of all virtue. Not just decisions or just acts or individual just souls, but justice itself. This is the thing that, like, Socrates is after in all of these early dialogues. It's always like, what is the nature of the pious? What is the nature of virtue itself? What is the nature of justice itself? Some abstract form, which you never see, It's not perceivable through the bodily senses. It's apprehendable through the mind only. Does that seem plausible enough? Whatever this capital J justice is, you never actually see it. Insofar as we talk about individual just acts, they're hazy representations of capital J justice. They get close. We might even think about this in terms of something like, I don't know, a circle. You ever seen a circle?
Not a real one.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know. Is that a circle? Kinda.
No.
It's not perfect.
It's not a perfect circle. Well, I'll draw it better.
That's right.
That one's an egg.
Forget circle. How about a straight line? You ever seen a straight line?
No, that's a straight line.
No.
It's not long enough.
Not long enough? A straight line segment, even?
It's only 179 degrees.
Perhaps, yeah. And if you got close enough in here, you'd see that it was all bumpy and jagged along the way too, right? Never seen a circle. I see approximations of circles, but I've never seen an actual circle. Circle, like a legit, like the geometric concept of a circle, geometric concept of a straight line, geometric concept of the number 3. These are things that, like, you get them here. You never get them here or here or here. You don't see, hear, feel, taste, touch these things. You intellect them, right? You apprehend them with the intellect alone. All right, who stole the eraser? Who does this? Takes erasers out of classrooms.
An unjust person.
I guess. All right. So this is what Socrates is getting at with this idea of like, philosophy, it's preparation for death. It's a separation of the soul from the body. Kind of in this jokey way that non-philosophers would be like, yeah, they're pretty close to dead already. So to kill a philosopher wouldn't really hurt them. What are they going to miss? Using their bodies? They're not using them already. And Socrates is like, yeah, sure, that. But also, what we do is we try to use our minds. And we try to do it in a way that we don't get what we can apprehend through the intellect confused with what we perceive with the senses. That's intro 1 and intro 2. From here, we get into some nice back and forth between Simmias and Cebes and Socrates. Simmias and Cebes are two Pythagorean guests who are there. Everybody's chit-chatting, talking. Socrates has talked about all the sense in which, philosophy is a preparation for death. This is what we've been trying to do all along. And everyone assembled, perhaps except for Simmias and Cebes, is like, yeah, right. So you're going to die. Big deal. That's what we wanted anyway, right? This is a lovely story. Nobody's sad now. We all walked in sad. Socrates has put our minds at ease. Yeah, he's going to die, but it's a good thing. Maybe we should try to follow him. Oh, but maybe the gods aren't done with us yet. But either way, I'm not going to be sad today. Because this is what any good philosopher would want. And Simmias and Cebes jump in. Cebes jumps in first. Cebes, ever the skeptic. He definitely seems to have like more of a skeptical edge to him than Simmias does. They're both friends with one another. Cebes, the skeptic, says, yeah, really? Like, you think that the soul is... I get what you're saying about the philosopher wanting to separate the soul from the body, but you keep talking as if, like, when you die, your soul will live on. Like, it's a good thing because now your soul will be separated from the body, and it's going to go and, like, do great philosophical things now. You're going to finally, like, become one with the form of justice or virtue or something. Like you'll see all these things clearly. You're gonna be able to give a proper logos for all of these questions. And CB says, yeah, but like what if the soul dissipates like smoke when you die? Oh, thank you. That was very lovely of you. Yeah, what if the soul dissipates like death when we die? Sure. Soul and the body are two separate things? Sure. The task of the philosopher is to separate the soul from the body, but that doesn't mean that the soul lives on afterwards. What if when the body dies, the soul just kind of gets blown away by the wind? Now everybody in the room is like, oh. Way to go, CBs. What a jerk. Just before this guy's about to die, he just told us this lovely story about how, like, yeah, it's gonna be fine. Don't be sad. It's gonna be fine. And CB's like, what if it's not fine? What if, like, you just, like, disappear afterwards? Socrates says, well, maybe. But then again, Socrates offers a rebuttal. He gives an argument from opposites. Yeah, when you hear this, you should be thinking like, Heraclitus? Is that you? Socrates says, hey, when something becomes taller, didn't it become taller from having been shorter before? If something was going to become shorter, it gets shorter from having been taller before. If something gets warmer, it gets warmer from having been colder before, and vice versa. When something becomes dead, it becomes dead from having been alive. Sure. And when something becomes alive, it becomes alive from having been dead. Ooh, that's weird. Have you ever thought about this? We have like all this business about like what happens to me after I die. This is a question that I think lots of people ask. Relatively fewer people wonder, where was I before I was born?
Very Eastern in this conversation.
Well, it's a history of Western philosophy, but I suppose
But
yeah.
the whole like past 10 minutes have been very, very Hindu Buddhist type discourse.
Both of them at the same time?
I agree. Yeah.
That might not be all that surprising. There have been folks like Peter King who have tried to say that like these disparate traditions all kind of came from the same roots. He puts it at the Eleatics. He says like the Eleatics started it and then it like went both east and west. Yeah, I think that's maybe that thesis is a tough one to play because sure, ideas can spread faster than people can, but yeah, it would have been really fast. It would have been within a couple of hundred years, and there wasn't a whole lot of contact between these cultures. But yeah, maybe this is like there didn't have to be contact. Maybe it's just a bunch of different people coming to the same place independently, which perhaps would be a little extra evidence that maybe they're onto something, right? If you come to the same conclusion through a bunch of different routes, that perhaps strengthens the conclusion a little bit. We are talking about reincarnation. I see how that has some affinities with Hindu thought. Where's the Buddhist part?
The dissipation of the soul is the actual description of nirvana.
Yeah. But is it permanent?
Yeah, it's freedom from reincarnation.
Yeah. In fact, yeah, we get this later on in Phaedo too. Socrates talks about maybe reincarnation is this, like you didn't get it right the first time. Go back and do it again. Yeah. And in fact, yeah, if you act like, and you're going to get justice in your reincarnation. If you acted like a beast, if you acted like an animal, if you were like greedy like a pig and just ate, you'll be reincarnated as a pig. And people are like, oh, I don't want it. Is that a punishment? And he's like, yeah, it's apparently what you wanted. Your soul is well suited for a pig life rather than a human life. You live like a human, you'll come back as a human. Live like a god, maybe you don't get reincarnated at all. You get to stay a soul, maybe something like that. Yeah, sure. This argument from opposites is an interesting one because it says it takes something that we find like relatively intuitive, these examples about tallness and shortness and warmness and coldness, and even something that seems like relatively intuitive, that like in order for something to become dead, it has to have first been alive. To the extent that I don't think like this table, is it alive? Nah. Is it dead? I don't know. It's just, it's not, yeah, it's just non-living, right? A corpse is non-living as well, but it's a special kind of non-living. It's a non-living that used to be alive. That's the thing that we call dead. So things that are dead became dead from having first been alive. And if all things come to be from their opposites, then coming to be alive has to come to be from being dead. Perhaps? Anybody who remembers at least a little bit of the Eleatics is going to be like, maybe. Maybe. This would be better than coming to be from not existing at all, right? Because that's a pickle. In order to come to be from non-being, now we got to talk about non-being being, and that's messed up, man. That's just conceptually incoherent. So the only way around this would be to say that, like, if you come to be alive, you had to have come to have been alive from having been dead beforehand. Which suggests a reincarnation, right? A cycle of reincarnation. Argument from opposites. All right, that's cool. Simmias says, hey, that's kind of reminiscent of the theory of recollection. Yeah, you see what he did there? That's a little reminiscent of the theory of recollection. And in fact, he says, I recall something about this, but I don't remember it all that well. Again, I don't remember the theory of recollection all that well. Could you jog my memory and remind me of it? And Socrates says, like, this is something that we've talked about before, this theory of recollection. And he tells this theory of recollection business, again, in a way that kind of inflicts it a little more towards the forms. This idea of the forms that we've seen already. That if it is the soul that apprehends the form of all things, or the forms of things, and not the body that gets them, that maybe this is how knowledge is acquired. This is, in fact, how we learn things. After all, before when I was doing this business of like drawing circles on the board, and I asked, like, have you ever seen a circle? And you said, no, I've never seen a circle. Then how do you know what a circle is if you've never seen one? You were taught? Or when somebody says, what's a circle? And the first time that you learned what a circle was, did somebody say, it's a collection of points that are equidistant from a point?
No, it's more like I'll try to put the square in the circle block as a kid, like the toy, and they were like, no.
Yeah.
That's a circle.
So somebody showed you a whole bunch of quasi-circles, right? Pseudo-circles. And they were like, these are all circles. And you're like, yeah, I reckon that they're all the same thing. Yeah. How is it that like we latch on to something? We can say the same thing about justice or virtue. When I see these things that aren't quite justice or virtue, when I see these things that aren't quite circles, how is it that I recognize them as circles? And Socrates says, this is like intimately tied to this theory of recollection. You have it in your soul already, which means that you must have been, your soul must have existed before you were born. You had to have like gotten this knowledge before your soul was married to your body. And this is why now when you see things that are similar to, or even when you see things that are different, recollection is funny that way, right? You can recollect, you can be reminded of something by seeing something that's similar to it. You could also be reminded of something by seeing something that's very different from it, right? In fact, if you saw a terrible injustice happen, that might be the sort of thing that like prompts you to start thinking about justice, right? It would be the absence of justice that kind of brings the concept of justice to mind, or the form of justice to mind. Socrates is trying to push this idea that you have to already have the abstract idea. You already have to have the form somewhere in your soul to even begin to recognize these things with the senses. This is wildly different than I think the way that most of us think about this. I think most of us think in terms of, I see a bunch of instances and then I abstract, like that it's kind of like an activity that I invent the concept, right? There's a whole bunch of things that they had something in common. We said, what does they all have in common? Well, they're all kind of resemble, not resemble this thing that I have no idea of, obviously, but we kind of invent the concept of a circle from lots of things that approximate circles. This is, I think, what a lot of folks contemporarily think. And for that reason alone, the idea, the story that Socrates is pitching here, or that Plato is pitching here in the theory of forms, might seem foreign to us, it might seem silly to us, but I'll recommend really, really strongly to you that precisely because it seems like a foreign and strange idea, make an even stronger effort to try to be charitable. Try to see like if where he's coming from makes any sense here. He's suggesting that it would have to, and this is actually no small philosophical debate, this question of like, what comes first? The concept or the particular instances that fit the concept? Do we see all the particular instances first and then we invent the abstract concept? Or do we have to have the abstract concept first to even begin to recognize that the specific instances are instances of the same thing? This comes back to like this demonstration that we saw over and over and over again in these early dialogues about like, yeah, there are all kinds of different virtues, but they're all virtue by virtue of belonging to the same class. What is that class? What is that abstract idea? We can look at what's going on in those early dialogues as an effort to try to invent the idea, but here in Phaedo, we're getting a sense that Socrates and Plato are suggesting that no. Maybe we're a little more committed to this. Remember when we looked at like the theory of recollection in Meno? I said like maybe it's a theory, maybe it's a myth. Socrates himself seems uncertain as to whether he's actually committed to this. It's shifting a little more from myth to theory now. We're getting some sense that this is what Socrates and Plato mean, Plato specifically, mean when they're talking about this theory of the forms, that it's something like the abstract concept has to be there first before you can recognize particular instances of it, rather than a whole bunch of instances that I then abstract from and invent the abstract concept. Yeah?
Would this fall under something like deja vu? Because if so, that also goes into nowadays. I remember reading an article where people can't seem to prove why deja vu occurs, why you feel like you are, why you have like a feeling that you've done something before, and it just sounds to me like the theory of recollection sounds like kind of like deja vu. Like you have that information stored somewhere, and when you see similarities between certain things, kind of like when you see a bunch of circles, you've already have that information kind of implanted. Maybe that's how you form like a personal description of it.
Yeah, perhaps. I'm not so certain. I'd be curious to see this article that you're talking about that says that scientists have no idea or that they're not certain of like why it is that deja vu happens. I believe that they're not 100% certain. But my sense is that there's some neurological explanation that's on offer. But yeah, so what would we say about deja vu? Is deja vu is it evidence of a past life? I've done this before. Literally, I've done this before in a past life. Or literally, this is reminiscent of something that I already had in my mind, in my soul.
I mean, I think it's interesting.
I think it's interesting too. It could be like a neurochemical quirk, right? It
Like
could just
glitch.
be, a little glitch in the matrix or something, right?
What about
Yeah.
deja vu in dreams?
Now we're just stacking the layers of weirdness. What about deja vu in dreams while I'm on LSD?
No, it's like haven't you ever had a dream where you feel like you remember something in that, like you feel like the dream was memorable, but it was something that never you never like heard.
Yeah, perhaps. I don't know if that's evidence that like I must have done it before,
Yeah,
right?
no, but, like-
It could just be. And this is kind of comes back to this idea when we were talking about this in Meno. I'm inclined to try to inflect this more towards like when something clicks, when you finally understand something, does that feel an awful lot like remembering something that you've forgotten? There's something there, right? This question of like what happens when everything snaps into place and you understand. In Meno, we were playing around that like maybe this is because the soul is immortal and you had the idea but you forgot it and now you're remembering the idea. Maybe it's something like that. And now we're getting something that's a little stronger that like, yeah, that's a thing because the soul is immortal. Yeah.
Couldn't you test that where you have like someone remembering something and then someone like discovering something new and seeing like parts of the brain like pop up or something like that, like the activity?
Yep.
If like if they're the same ones, then like isn't that something that could be kind of tested in a way?
My guess is it probably has been tested through a very similar method to the one that you described. Yeah. I encourage you all, like, yeah, go ahead. Like, see what neurologists have to say about déjà vu. I don't have it at my fingertips right now. But, you know, if only everybody had access to, like, all of the information in human history at their fingertips. Like a computer in your pocket or something like that. Or on your lap. Feel free, anybody, to look up what déjà vu is all about while we're talking now. Yes?
Do it.
So if you live like a continuous life like throughout your soul and you've just been reincarnated, does that mean like you know everything, but just like you just forget certain things, like when you're in certain bodies?
Yeah, and we might wonder, like, this is going to be this question of, like, so, like, if you know everything already, wait, like, do I know everything? Do I know, like, what's going to happen next? Do I know the next thing that you're going to say? Maybe these are not the things that I know. This is going to be actually a running question. A little bit, we're going to get some little tantalizing hints of it here in Phaedo. It's going to become a little bit clearer in the middle books of Republic that we read, where we're looking at the allegory of the cave and the divided line. It's going to become way more explicit when we read and talk about Parmenides. But yeah, there is this question of if we're going to go ahead and buy into this and say, yeah, there's a theory of recollection and the soul is born already equipped with all of like the forms. What are those forms? Like it's not going to be every little possible thing. You're like when we say like you're going to know everything, it's not going to be every detail of the world. What are the things that are going to count as like known before any experience happens? I saw a bunch of people like shaking their heads or nodding their heads when I was talking about this question of like, do we see lots of particular instances and then abstract the abstract concept from them? Or do we have the abstract concept first and then recognize the particular instances as instances of the concept when we go? And some folks are like, obviously, we see the particular instances first and then we invent by abstraction. We invent the concept. I don't know if that's that clear. Without going into a whole lot of details, this is a problem that's going to pop up again more than 1,000 years later in Immanuel Kant. If you take the modern philosophy class, the next history of philosophy class after this ancient one, where we'll talk about this is a big, big puzzle for Kant as well, where it's this question of like, yeah, like how can you even begin to make sense of the world if you don't already have some concepts? Concepts are the way that these ideas are the way that I start dividing the world up into like, here's a thing, and here's a thing, and here's a thing. If I don't have any concepts at all, what does the world look like to me? Yeah, if there's no innate knowledge at all, this is one of the things that's on the line here in this theory of recollection conversation is there any kind of innate knowledge at all? Is there any kind of knowledge that I have to have in order to begin to make sense of the world in the first place? If we think of like what is the way that like a newborn infant sees the world, if they have zero concepts, if they're like a Lockean tabula rasa, right? They're just a blank slate, nothing in their mind, then the world is just going to be chaos. It's going to be like, rah! Just noise and colors, maybe not even colors, just like everything. And like to even begin to say like, that's a face, that's a different face. Like you need face already, right? You need to have that concept to even begin to make sense of the world. And this is this argument that's going to run for thousands of years and is still kind of going on, that Plato is kind of beginning. Nobody's really like had this Not to my knowledge. Nobody at least wrote it down. Nobody had that thought before. This is a brand new thought, and it's a real riddle. Yeah.
Well, where do concepts come from then? Like, in all the way back in like prehistoric days, like where
does the concept come from? Yeah. If we need the concept to even begin to make sense of the world, then where does the concept come from? Yeah. Ain't that the question? And one of the answers is, you must have always had it. Another answer is, you develop the concept through, like, making sense of the world. Somebody goes, dog, 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 and you go, dog, they're all dogs. What do they all have in common? You invent the concept, right? So perhaps that is how some concepts are formed. They are formed through, like, the activity of abstraction. They're invented by the folks who use them. But it's not clear if they can all be invented like that, because otherwise how are you going to even get going, right? You can't just pull yourself up by your own bootstraps if you got no bootstraps. Okay. That's reminiscent of the theory of recollection. And Socrates is like, yeah. And then he gives us this version of the theory of recollection that comes back into concept with this theory of forms. And Simmias says, all right, I see where we're going with this. I like this. This makes sense. But Socrates, this explains why my soul has to have existed before I was born. That whole theory of recollection, if we're buying into this idea that, like, you must have had these forms already in your soul before you were born. Otherwise, how are you going to even begin to start making sense of the world? Like, how could you even get started? We could say, like, you can invent concepts, but, like, I have to at least start carving the world up into, like, some distinct things to even begin to make concepts, right? So if I can't get started at all without some kind of prior knowledge, something already in my soul, in my mind, then yeah, I must have existed before I was born. I must have been dead before I was born. Simmias says, that explains how you must have been dead before you were born, but it doesn't answer to this question. It doesn't say that, like, you have to continue to exist after you die. It doesn't convince us that the soul is immortal, just that it must have existed before we were born. That's it. To which everybody in the room is like, God damn it. You had us for a second there. We were like, oh yeah, the soul is immortal. Good. Good. No, maybe it's not. Simmias and CBs, you guys are jerks. Socrates doesn't seem to be bothered by this at all, by the way, right? He's loving it. He's like, good question. Yeah, let's address this. And Socrates' response to this new challenge, which is actually kind of the old challenge, it's just pointing out that he hasn't actually responded to Cebes' first objection. What if the soul dissipates like smoke? Well, we get this argument from opposites, which indicates that, like, I must have existed before I was born as a dead person, as a soul without a body, perhaps, something like that. And Simmias says, like, yeah, like the theory of recollection. Socrates is like, yeah, like theory of recollection, which is, like, related intimately to this theory of forms that I'm just now starting to work out for you guys. And then Simmias says, yeah, but that doesn't tell me that the soul lives on after it gets separated from the body. It might still dissipate in a puff of smoke. And Socrates offers yet another argument. This time, what's usually referred to as, let's go ahead and call this 5. the argument from Affinity. Which is basically an argument by analogy. This idea that like things are alike. That's almost so tautologist as to sound stupid, but yeah, like things are alike. If things have a certain set of similarities, there's good reason to suspect that they're going to have additional similarities as well. That's how an argument by analogy works. If I say, like, case A has properties A, B, C, D, E, and F. Case B has properties A, B, C, D, and E. What do we think? Does it have property F? And we say, like, yeah, there's a good chance. That's a reason to suspect that it maybe has property F as well. In this argument from Affinity, Socrates says, well, let's look at the body. What's the body like? It's divisible, right? The body can be divided, like I can chop my arm off. There, my body's been divided. It's destructible. It's material. The body comes to know other bodily things, right? The body comes to know other material things through the bodily senses. But the mind, the soul, what does the soul familiarize itself with? What does the soul come to know? These forms, right? Justice, virtue, capital J justice, capital V virtue, capital P piety, these sorts of things. Are those things destructible? These abstract concepts, can they be divided? Can they be broken apart? Can they be destroyed? Or are they eternal? Is justice, whatever justice is, if there is a capital J justice, is it like justice for all time? Never to change. And some folks might be, yeah, but our ideas of justice, they do change over time. And yet, yeah, our ideas of justice do, but what about real justice? People used to believe that it was okay to own other people. Was that the justice of the time? People used to believe that women shouldn't be allowed to vote, or even leave the house. Was that just the justice of the time and we have a different justice? Or is there one justice for everybody? And we had it wrong previously. One way of looking at this would be to say, like, cultures that have in the past, or maybe do currently, say things like women shouldn't be allowed to vote or even leave the house. Are they wrong? Despite the fact that that's what they believe. Suggesting that there is like one justice that never changes. Justice itself doesn't change. Our ideas of it might change, but justice itself doesn't change. If the things that the mind knows are unchanging and eternal, the things that the body comes to know are changing and ephemeral. They can be broken down, they can be destroyed, etc., etc. And if we ask ourselves, like, well, the body is material, and the things that the body knows are material things. The mind seems to be immaterial. The things that the mind knows are immaterial. The things that the mind knows are also eternal. Then the mind is probably eternal as well. Through this argument by analogy, mind is like the forms. It's eternal, deathless. In short, immortal. Just like the forms that it apprehends. And this, everybody says, oh yeah, that makes sense. And everybody starts to feel really, really good. And Simmias and Cebes start whispering between each other. They're like, I don't know. And Socrates says, like, hey, what are you guys talking about? And Simmias and Cebes say, like, it's not a big deal. No, out with it. Let's hear it. What's the big whoop? What's going on? You want to share it with the rest of us? And they're like, we still have doubts. And everyone's like, they still have doubts. And they give two new arguments in the form of little metaphors, figures, right? They each offer a separate figure. One is maybe the soul is like a harmony and the body is like a harp. And the other one is maybe the soul is like a tailor and the body is like a cloak that the tailor wears. And after they've given both of these, everybody gets very, very discouraged and very, very bummed out. That's where we'll pick up at our next meeting.